For those who might not know what intergenerational trauma is, do you mind explaining it?
Yeah, absolutely. So intergenerational trauma is the type of trauma that flows through families from one generation to the next. And it's the only type of trauma that is actually handed down. Okay. So intergenerational trauma happens to be at the intersection of what I call like the biology of intergenerational trauma, which is like a lot of the genetics and the ways in which when a parent is traumatized, their genetics change or they re-express to say, I'm in a traumatized body, and that gets handed down to their children. Mm-hmm. And then there's the psychological piece, which is anything that happens once a person is born that can trigger a trauma response. So both of those have to be present for there to be intergenerational trauma.
What would be an example?
The ways that we start off knowing, okay, intergenerational trauma may be in the mix here, is usually when a person starts saying, well, you know, I had a history of being completely berated by my mother, and I do the same to my child. And so we're starting to see the thread, right? Okay. That there's already behaviors that are trauma responses that are being held in multiple generations. And that's usually where the conversation starts, where we start saying, okay, this is not just a trauma of something that happened to you, but this is something that has been modeled. It's something that's in the genetic pool of your family. Let's take a deeper dive and a deeper look into that.
Are people usually aware when they come to you that this is happening, or are you the one to tell them this is intergenerational trauma?
There's a little bit of a mixed bag still, right? Because I think intergenerational trauma is still not a common language that people are using around their healing or around just their understanding of what's happening.
It just doesn't sound good either. And people have this idea of trauma that it's like a big event. Yeah. And they come to therapy and then you have to be the one to tell them, no, this is still trauma.
Yeah. I mean, we're still destigmatizing a lot of what trauma is.
Exactly.
And you're right. I really see that. I see that people want to talk about, you know, stress more than they want to talk about trauma. But when we're talking about chronic stress, we have to really look at the underpinnings of it. And in reality, there's usually some sort of a triggering event, and that triggering event is a traumatic event. Yeah. But we don't really, you know, want to utilize those words because they're labels that not a lot of people want.
What does that look like in a person? Symptoms, or what do you look for?
There are different types of symptoms. So there are the more mood-based symptoms, like you know, a shift in mood to irritability. That tends to be really prominent, to anger or angry outbursts. There's also, you know, a change. A lot of the symptoms around like the psychological symptoms tend to mirror a lot of like trauma-based symptoms. So there's, you know, a change in appetite sometimes. There's a change in how a person is connecting to others. There's a change in how a person is feeling around themselves, really, their self-concept. There's changes in that are more metabolic, like the ways that their bodies are being, the ways that they're like experiencing their own bodies, their sleep. I mean, there's like so many different variations of these symptoms. But really the more significant marker of intergenerational trauma is that whatever it is that we're seeing, that there were versions of that in previous generations. Okay. That if a person suffers from chronic headaches, and if they're also suffering from appetite suppression, and they're constantly feeling sad, and that, you know, they're feeling disconnected from the people in their lives, and they have all these multitude of symptoms, and their mother was very much experiencing the same symptoms in her lifetime, that now we're looking at something that has that intergenerational tie.
Okay. What can we do for ourselves, or what can we tell ourselves to start healing the intergenerational trauma?
The point of recognition is really important, right? Okay. Because for a lot of us, we still aren't at a place where we're like, yeah, that's what I'm going through. So that's, of course, going to be
that's
key.
The first step.
Yeah.
But if you're listening to this podcast and you're like, I feel like I might have that. Is there anything you can tell yourself to just begin the process besides obviously seeking therapy.
Yeah. I mean, if with a therapist, it would be, I think, even better. Yeah, you to go through the process of like understanding how intergenerational trauma has been a part of your journey. But you know, I have an upcoming book on this topic, and I will be like presenting like a number of different practices that people can do on a daily basis, which I'm excited about, because I think that gets at what people are able to do to get themselves out of this type of trauma. But if in this very day a person can start doing one thing, I think it's really deciding how they're going to settle their body, whether it's going to be like meditation, if it's going to be breathing, if it's going to be humming and rocking, which I love to do also with people. It's all of those things. That's going to be key. And then step 2 is really kind of getting at that family history, which is where I recommend, you know, you start
asking questions.
Yeah. Well, you know.
So how was grandma?
Yeah. Or like, you know, people that are maybe a little too shy about asking those questions or think that they're going to ruffle some feathers and it's not going to go well. They can just start thinking about, well, what have been my trauma responses? What have I experienced in my lifetime, just me, that feels like a trauma response or feels like a trigger response or feels like something that I do or I say whenever I feel unsettled and I feel like there's a threat in front of me. And then map it back. Well, how is this familiar?
Like, where have I seen this before?
Exactly. Who did this at home when I was growing up? Who did this in my community? Because sometimes our communities have trauma responses that are very community centered. And so like starting to just build that understanding, I think that can be a really enlightening process for folks, but always while doing some really good meditative and nervous system settling work, so that, you know, because it can kick up a lot for folks too.
But what are some of the simple shifts that we can do in our everyday life that can lead us to true healing? I
think that when people think about healing, they get a little overwhelmed. They think, I got to do a lot. And in reality, it's all the small things that you do in your day that can actually contribute to the healing itself. So I typically like to recommend that people start their day with healing, because if you just think about doing it throughout the day or maybe at nighttime,
you won't get to it.
You're not going to get to it.
So it's almost like wake up and exercise, but wake up and do healing exercise.
Yeah. Okay. Because, you know, what's going to happen is that more often than not, people are going to deprioritize their healing, and also you don't see the effects right away. So people start saying, I'll just leave that to whatever time. Yeah. But if you start your day with just 5 minutes of doing whatever practice feels right to you, whether it's meditation, if it's a light stretch, if it's yoga, if it's humming to your favorite song. Most songs are 5 minutes. So when you hum, you actually initiate a relaxation response in your nervous system. So actually humming for 5 minutes your favorite song at the top of your day, that already is a healing practice that can help your body. Yeah.